The next morning felt like any other. Coffee bitter on his tongue, inbox already full, the city roaring outside the window. But beneath the surface, something small and restless had begun to stir. That unanswered question from the night before still lived inside him, like a splinter he couldn't pull out. What would happen if I stopped being available? He wasn't sure where to find an answer. He only knew he couldn't keep living as he had been, every day drained dry, every night haunted by a gnawing emptiness. And then, by what felt less like chance and more like fate, he stumbled across a book. A Voice Across Time. The cover was simple, worn at the edges, a secondhand shop find that practically fell into his hands. Carl Jung, Modern Man in Search of a Soul. He had heard the name before in passing, Swiss psychologist, early 20th century, the one who talked about dreams, archetypes, and something called the shadow, but he had never actually read him. That night, he cracked the book open. The pages smelled faintly of dust and old wood, like a door creaking open to another era. And within the first few lines, it was as though someone had been watching him his whole life. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." He paused, reread it. The words didn't just describe people around him, they described him. Every annoyance, every exhaustion, every moment he felt used by others wasn't just about them. It was about what he had allowed, what he had given away, what he hadn't protected. The book seemed to whisper, it was never them, it was always you. As he read further, Jung described something called the persona, the mask we wear to meet the expectations of society, friends, and family. The version of ourselves built not on truth, but on approval. And suddenly it clicked. That was his life. A carefully constructed mask of agreeableness, reliability, and availability. A mask that smiled when he was suffocating. A mask that answered the phone when all he wanted was silence. The realization cut deep. His exhaustion wasn't an accident. It was the price of wearing the mask too long. He set the book down, staring at the ceiling. How long had he been living as a mask instead of a man? How many times had he silenced the real voice inside him just to keep others happy? And worst of all, did anyone actually know him, or did they only know the mask? The next day, he walked into the office, the book still fresh in his mind. And for the first time, he looked at his coworkers not as people who needed him, but as mirrors. The colleague who always dumped extra tasks on him, what was that reflecting? Maybe his inability to say no. The friend who only called in crisis, what was that reflecting? Maybe his fear of disappointing someone. The family member who made him feel guilty, what was that reflecting? Maybe his lifelong terror of being unloved. It wasn't about them. It was about him. And that thought was terrifying, because if the problem had always been him, then the solution couldn't be waiting for them to change. The solution had to come from him too. The taste of withdrawal. Later that week, the test came. His phone buzzed. Another request. Someone wanted him to step in, fix something, rescue them. This time, he didn't answer. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of a deliberate, trembling choice. Minutes passed, then hours. He half expected the sky to fall, the friendship to shatter, the world to collapse because he dared not be available. But nothing happened. The world spun on. The city lights blinked as always. The only thing that did happen was silence. And in that silence, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: space. Fear and freedom. That silence was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it made him feel guilty, like he had committed some crime by protecting his own energy. Liberating because for once he wasn't being pulled like a puppet. He thought of Jung again, the way the psychologist spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole, authentic, complete. Maybe this was it. Not some grand revelation, not a lightning strike from the heavens, but a quiet refusal to keep abandoning himself. Each moment of withdrawal was like reclaiming a piece of his soul, a fragment he hadn't realized he'd lost. The pushback. But silence doesn't go unnoticed. The next day, messages poured in. "Are you okay? Why didn't you pick up? You're acting weird." Some were cloaked in concern, others laced with irritation. But beneath them all, he saw the same thing: panic. It wasn't really worry about him, it was panic about losing access to him, panic that their emergency button wasn't working anymore. And for the first time, he didn't rush to explain himself. He didn't launch into apologies or excuses, he just let the silence linger. The responses spoke louder than any explanation ever could. They revealed who truly cared and who simply needed him to keep playing his role. A voice within the silence. That night, with the city muted outside his window, he picked up the book again. Jung had written of psychic energy, the idea that every thought, every emotion, every action drained or conserved the soul's strength. The question wasn't whether life drained you, the question was, are you choosing where your energy goes, or is the world choosing for you? He closed his eyes. For the first time, he felt that choice humming within him, a fragile, trembling, but unmistakable voice rising from somewhere deep inside. Not the voice of the mask, not the voice trained to please, to soothe, to answer on command, but his own voice. And it said, very quietly, "It's time."
The office was buzzing when he walked in Monday morning. Phones ringing, keyboards clattering, the faint hum of the copy machine filling the background. People rushed from cubicle to cubicle with coffee cups in hand, trading jokes and deadlines. He dropped his bag by his desk, but before he could even open his laptop, a voice called out, "Hey, could you take a quick look at this? I know it's not your area, but you're so good at catching details." The mask went on without hesitation. A polite smile, a nod. "Sure, no problem." It was automatic, like muscle memory. He didn't want to say yes, but the words slipped out anyway, smooth and practiced. That was the mask, the reliable, agreeable version of himself that everyone had come to expect. A lifetime of conditioning. He couldn't even remember when the mask had formed. Maybe it was in childhood, when being the good kid meant fewer arguments at the dinner table. Maybe it was in high school, when saying yes kept him in good standing with teachers and friends. Maybe it was simply how he survived, by keeping the peace, by being useful, by never letting anyone down. Over the years, the mask fused so tightly to his skin that people no longer saw him. They only saw what he provided, his willingness, his availability, his compliance. And the terrifying truth was this: if he ever took the mask off, would there be anything underneath that people still loved? That day, the strings were everywhere. A coworker dumped extra spreadsheets on his desk with a grateful smile. A friend texted in all caps, "Call me ASAP." His mother left a voicemail that began with, "You never check in anymore." Each tug of the string demanded a reaction. Each pull asked him to abandon whatever he was doing, whoever he was, to become what they needed in that moment. And like a marionette, he moved. He adjusted, responded, explained, reassured. Every reaction felt like a betrayal of the quiet voice inside him, the one that had whispered, "It's time." The cracks began to show. By lunchtime, he could feel it. The tension between his real self and the mask. It was like wearing a suit 2 sizes too small, suffocating, stiff, exhausting to maintain. At one point, a coworker joked, "Man, you're always here for everyone. Don't you ever get tired of it?" He laughed with them, but inside the question stung. because the answer was yes. He was tired, bone tired, soul tired. But admitting it out loud would mean peeling back the mask, and he wasn't sure he was ready for what people would see. At the dinner table. That evening, he had dinner with his family. The clinking of cutlery, the familiar smells of food, the same well-worn conversations. How's work? Busy, but fine. You should visit more often. I know. I'll try. On the surface, everything looked normal, but beneath it, he felt the strings tightening again. Every answer was rehearsed, safe, expected. He wanted to say, "I'm exhausted. I feel invisible. I don't know who I am anymore." But the mask smiled, nodded, promised he would try harder. Driving home afterward, he gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. The silence in the car was deafening. He realized he hadn't spoken a single genuine word all night. The puppet and the puppeteers. It struck him then. People didn't need to control him directly. They didn't shout, threaten, or command. They didn't have to. All they had to do was tug lightly, and he danced. They tugged with guilt. "You never call enough." They tugged with flattery. "You're so good at this, I knew you'd help." They tugged with neediness. "Please, I don't know who else to turn to." And each time he moved without thinking. The worst part wasn't that they pulled the strings. The worst part was that he had tied the strings to himself in the first place. A glimpse of rebellion. Later that night, scrolling through his phone, another request popped up. A friend wanting him to review something, just a quick glance. His thumb hovered over the screen. He thought of Jung's words, the book on his nightstand, the voice whispering, "It's time." For a full minute, he didn't respond. He set the phone down, walked to the kitchen, drank a glass of water. For the first time, he let the message sit unanswered. It was a small act, almost laughably small, but it felt monumental. A tiny cut in the strings that held him. The aftermath. But rebellion has consequences. Within an hour, his phone buzzed again. "Did you get my message? Hello? Are you there?" Panic surged in his chest. He can almost hear the accusations forming. Selfish, unreliable, different. The guilt pressed down hard, whispering that he should just give in, reply, be the version of himself everyone wanted. But he didn't. He sat in the silence, heart pounding, staring at the phone screen, glowing in the dark. And though the guilt gnawed at him, something else flickered underneath. Pride. Because for the first time, he had chosen not to dance when the strings were pulled. The question returns. Lying in bed, he thought of the mask again. How long could he keep wearing it before it crushed him entirely? How long before there was nothing left of his real self beneath it? The silence around him was heavy, but inside that silence, a seed of defiance grew. What if I cut all the strings? What if I tore the mask off completely? Who would still stand beside me, and who would vanish the moment I stopped being useful? The question scared him, but for the first time, they didn't feel like a threat. They felt like a doorway. And though he didn't know what waited on the other side, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go back to being the puppet he had been.
The first time he walked away mid-argument, it felt like betrayal. Not betrayal of the other person, but betrayal of the version of himself that had always stayed, always explained, always defended. It happened at work. A coworker criticized him sharply in front of others, tossing words designed to provoke. The old him would have scrambled to justify himself, heart racing, cheeks burning, desperate to prove he wasn't at fault. But this time, he simply stopped speaking. He looked at them calmly, let their words hang in the air like smoke, and then turned back to his desk.
The silence was seismic. The room shifted. The coworker fumbled, unsettled, suddenly exposed without the sparring partner they had counted on. For the first time, he saw it clearly. Silence doesn't mean defeat. Silence means control. The shift in energy. After that day, something began to change, not just in him, but in the people around him. He no longer rushed to answer emails within minutes. He let calls go to voicemail. He declined invitations with a simple, "I can't." And each time he withdrew, the same pattern repeated. Irritation, confusion, pushback. Some accused him of arrogance. Others grew more insistent, pressing harder for his attention. But what surprised him most was how quickly the energy in the room shifted when he stopped being predictable. When he no longer fed the fire of every complaint, the complainers fell silent. When he didn't rush to soothe, people found ways to soothe themselves. When he didn't offer explanations, people filled the gaps with their own discomfort. The silence was no longer emptiness, it was leverage. Seeing the puppeteers. At a family gathering, he tested it again. His mother sighed the familiar sigh, the one weighted with guilt. You never visit enough. Usually he would launch into apologies, promising to come more often, explaining how busy he was. But this time, he just listened. He didn't argue, didn't justify. The silence stretched long enough that she finally said, "Well, I know you're busy. I just miss you sometimes." And suddenly, the guilt transformed into something honest, something vulnerable. Beneath the manipulation lay a truth she hadn't spoken in years. She missed him. It hit him then. Silence didn't just protect him. Silence revealed others. The hidden faces. One by one, the people in his life began to show their real faces when met with silence. The friend who thrived on drama grew louder, angrier, trying to provoke him into reacting. The coworker who used him as a dumping ground for extra work suddenly avoided him. The relative who expected instant availability accused him of being selfish. And in each reaction, he saw the truth Jung had written about. People weren't reacting to him, they were reacting to the loss of control. His silence stripped away the masks they wore, exposing the emptiness, the neediness, the dependency they had projected onto him. The taste of authority.
The message came late on a Thursday night. His phone buzzed against the wooden nightstand, the screen flashing with the familiar name. A friend, one of those who only called when the world was falling apart. Normally, he would have picked up right away. He knew the script by heart. Frantic words spilling through the line, him offering calm reassurances, staying awake until dawn to make someone else feel better while his own chest felt heavier with each hour. But this time, he didn't move. The phone buzzed once, twice, 3 times, then stopped. He lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, heart hammering as though he had committed some great crime. The weight of silence. The silence was deafening. Every second felt like a test. His body screamed at him to cave in, to reach for the phone, to put the mask back on and play his role. But he didn't. Instead, he let the silence linger. He let the unanswered call hang in the air, thick and uncomfortable. And it was in that silence that he realized how deeply conditioned he had been.
He'd been trained by family, by friends, by himself to believe that not answering was the same as betrayal, that withholding himself was cruelty, that his worth existed only in his availability. Yet here he was, proving the opposite. The world had not ended just because he chose himself for one night. The backlash. The next morning, the messages came. "Hey, why didn't you pick up? I really needed you last night. Are you mad at me or something?" He read them with a strange mix of guilt and clarity. He wasn't mad. He wasn't punishing anyone. He was just choosing silence. Still, he could sense the irritation laced beneath the words. His absence had disrupted the script. His silence had stolen the control others expected to have over him. And that, he realized, was the true power of withdrawal. It unsettled those who depended on his predictability. The acarications. That evening, the phone rang again. He answered this time, his voice calm but restrained. "You didn't answer me yesterday. That's not like you." He swallowed. "I was tired." "You're always there for me," they pressed. "What's going on? You're acting different." Different. The word stung, but not for the reason it used to. Once, different meant rejection. Now, it meant progress. "I just needed some time to myself," he said quietly. The silence on the other end was heavy. Then came the accusation. "So, you're too busy for your friends now? You've changed." And there it was. The backlash he had feared. The moment someone took his silence as selfishness, as betrayal, as proof he was no longer the puppet they knew. But instead of explaining, instead of justifying, instead of spilling words to patch the wound, he simply listened. He let their frustration echo against the wall of his calm. And though his chest tightened, though guilt clawed at him, he stayed silent. The earthquake within. When the call ended, he sat on the edge of the bed, trembling. He had survived it, the anger, the accusations, the pressure to go back to who he was. And though it shook him to his core, he felt something stirring beneath the fear, something strong, something like freedom. It dawned on him that people's reactions said less about him than about them. His withdrawal had not destroyed the friendship, it had revealed its foundation. It showed who truly valued him for himself and who only valued him for what he gave. And once seen, that truth could not be unseen. The taste of power. Over the next few days, he began to experiment, small acts of silence, like planting seeds in secret soil. He didn't reply to every message the moment it arrived. He declined a last-minute request with nothing more than, "Sorry, I can't." He left a group conversation without explaining why. Each time, the same pattern unfolded. Confusion, irritation, accusations. And each time he held steady, resisting the urge to justify himself. And something remarkable began to happen. The less he reacted, the more powerful he felt. Not power over others, but power over himself. Power to choose, power to protect his own energy. It was intoxicating, this quiet sovereignty. The world adjusts, but the world doesn't surrender easily. His withdrawal created ripples. People who once leaned on him started to pull harder, testing his boundaries. Some grew colder, distant. Others accused him of being arrogant, selfish, detached. Yet a few, very few, responded differently. They respected the silence. They gave him space. They didn't demand explanations. And it was then that he saw the divide. Those who cared for himself, and those who only cared for what he provided. The mask had kept everyone close. Silence revealed who truly belonged. The reflection. One evening, sitting in the quiet of his apartment, he thought of Jung again. The psychologist had written about individuation, the process of becoming whole. Jung said that silence wasn't absence, but presence, the kind of presence that comes when you no longer scatter your energy across 100 unworthy demands. He looked around his apartment. For the first time, it felt different. Not just a place to collapse after serving others, but a place where he could hear his own thoughts. A place where silence wasn't emptiness,
but fullness. And as he sat there, the voice inside him, the one that had once been so faint, grew louder. This is only the beginning.
The silence, once empowering, soon began to ache. At first, it was exhilarating to withdraw, to say no, to feel the strings loosening. But as the days turned into weeks, he began to notice the emptiness that followed. The phone rang less, messages slowed, invitations dwindled. The people who once leaned on him daily were vanishing into the distance, leaving only a faint echo of their need. And though part of him knew this was the point, that he was finally free from being used, another part felt abandoned. The loneliness. It crept in slowly, like fog rolling over a quiet field. Nights once filled with constant calls were now spent alone, the apartment hushed, the silence pressing in from every wall. He sat with a book open in his lap, but realized he hadn't turned a page in an hour. His eyes stared at the words, but his mind was somewhere else, on the friends who had stopped calling, the relatives who had grown distant, the sudden absence of noise that once made him feel needed. It was one thing to withdraw. It was another thing to live in the hollow space that withdrawal created, and the hollow felt endless. Accusations in the dark. The guilt returned, harsher than ever. In the stillness of night, it whispered like a cruel judge. "You're selfish. No wonder they left. You pushed them away. You'll end up alone, and it will be your fault." The voice was relentless. It sounded like his own, yet layered with echoes of every disappointed parent, every angry friend, every voice that had ever told him he was different when he chose himself. Sometimes the voice grew so loud that he nearly picked up the phone, nearly sent the message, nearly put the mask back on. But then he remembered the exhaustion he had felt when he was always available, and the thought of returning to that prison stopped him. Shadows at the table. At a family dinner, the shift was even clearer. Conversations flowed around him, but with a subtle coldness. A cousin remarked lightly, "You've been so distant lately," and the table laughed, though the jab was sharp. He smiled politely, but inside his chest tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he wasn't distant, he was healing, he was protecting, he was learning to breathe again. But he said nothing. The silence, once his weapon, now felt like chains. He wondered if this was the cost of selfhood, being misunderstood, ridiculed, cast aside. Jung's warning. That night, back in his apartment, he opened Jung's book again. Jung had written that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires a period of isolation. Not isolation as punishment, but as transformation. He read the words slowly, letting them sink in. Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. And suddenly, he understood. The loneliness he felt wasn't just about losing people. It was about losing the mask. The old connections had been built on his availability, not his authenticity. Without the mask, he no longer had the language to relate to them, and they no longer knew how to relate to him. The ache of being misunderstood. What hurt most wasn't the absence of people, it was the way those who remained looked at him now. Some called him cold, others said he was arrogant, distant, not the same anymore. And in a way, they were right. He wasn't the same. He had changed. But instead of celebrating that change, they resented it. His silence made them uncomfortable. His boundaries made them defensive. His withdrawal forced them to face their own dependence, and many couldn't bear it. The ache of being misunderstood cut deeper than loneliness, because misunderstanding meant rejection, and rejection reopened the oldest wound of all, the desert of solitude. Weeks passed like this, and solitude became his desert, a dry, barren stretch of existence where every step felt heavier than the last. He went to bed wondering if he had made a mistake. He woke wondering if he would ever feel whole again. But in that desert, something subtle began to happen. With no one to answer to, no one to react to, no one to perform for, he began to hear himself more clearly. His thoughts, once drowned out by noise, surfaced slowly, like stones appearing as the tide recedes. He noticed small things, the way sunlight fell across his kitchen table in the morning, the way the city's hum softened after midnight, the way his own breath sounded when he sat still long enough to hear it. The solitude was painful, but within the pain was a strange clarity, the strength within. One evening, sitting alone at the window, he whispered to himself, "This is what it means to rebuild." The words surprised him, but they felt true. He realized solitude wasn't punishment, it was scaffolding. It was the empty space required to construct something new. It was here, in the quiet ache of being alone, that he was beginning to discover the strength hidden within himself, a strength not built on applause, approval, or validation, but on presence, his own presence. And as the night deepened, he felt it, faint, fragile, but undeniable. Not joy, not peace, not yet, but a seed of something stronger than both. Resilience.
It began subtly, almost too quietly to notice. A colleague who once dropped last-minute tasks on his desk now hesitated before asking. The friend who used to call at midnight for endless venting no longer expected him to pick up every time. Even his family, after weeks of sighs and guilt, had started to phrase their requests more carefully, less demanding, more considerate. At first, he thought it was coincidence, but soon he realized something profound. The less available he became, the more carefully people approached him. Scarcity and respect. He thought of gold, not because gold is shinier than other metals, but because it's rare. People guard it, protect it, respect it. For years, he had treated his own presence like water, flowing freely, endlessly for anyone who asked. And like water, people drank without thinking, without gratitude. But now, by becoming scarce, he had shifted. He was no longer taken for granted. He was no longer the faucet anyone could turn on at will. And for the first time, people valued him, not just for what he gave, but for the fact that he couldn't always be reached. The irony of absence. It was ironic, he thought, how absence could create more presence than constant availability ever did. At work, when he spoke in meetings, people listened more closely. His words carried weight, not because he raised his voice, but because he no longer wasted them. Among friends, his appearance at gatherings felt more significant. The fewer times he said yes, the more meaningful each yes became. Even in family conversations where guilt had once ruled, something had shifted. His boundaries, once mocked or resisted, were beginning to command respect. His absence had become its own kind of authority. The old voices return. Of course, the shadow still whispered, "You're selfish. They'll leave you if you don't keep giving. Don't get too comfortable. This won't last." But now, he recognized those voices for what they were. Echoes of the old conditioning, relics of the mask. And for the first time, he could answer them with confidence. No, my presence is not a commodity. My energy is not infinite, and I am not selfish for protecting it. The voices didn't vanish, but they grew quieter each time he spoke back. The anger of the dependent. Not everyone adjusted gracefully. Some lashed out. One friend accused him bluntly, "You think you're better than us now. You're always so busy with your new boundaries." He felt the sting of the words, but instead of defending himself, he stayed silent. He knew what the anger truly meant. This person missed the version of him that was endlessly available, endlessly pliable, endlessly useful. It wasn't him they wanted, it was access to him. And losing that access made them furious. But their anger no longer controlled him. The revelation. Walking home one evening, he thought of Jung again. The old psychologist had written about psychic energy, that when misused, it leaks away into arguments, justifications, and meaningless reactions.
But when guarded, it creates presence. He understood it now. His silence wasn't just protecting him, it was shaping how others perceived him. By not giving himself away so freely, he had become a presence people noticed, respected, even desired. He laughed quietly to himself. The lesson was so simple, yet it had taken him years to learn. What is too abundant is taken for granted. What is rare is valued. A new kind of magnetism. He noticed something else too. His relationships began to shift in quality. The ones who stayed were different now. They reached out with intention, not just desperation. They valued his time. They listened as much as they spoke. With them, silence was not awkward, but comfortable. With them, absence did not mean rejection, but trust. It was as if by drawing back, he had made space for a different kind of bond, one based not on need, but on respect. The mirror of value. One afternoon, sitting in a cafe, he overheard two strangers talking. One said, "He's always around. He'll do it." And they both laughed. The words struck him like a blade, not because they were about him, but because once they could have been about him. He remembered all the times he had been that person, the one always around, always available, always convenient. And he realized now that people don't respect what they don't have to earn. And it dawned on him that his worth had never been absent, it had only been hidden beneath overexposure. Like a painting left too long in sunlight, its colors had faded until people forgot its beauty. By withdrawing, by stepping into silence, he had restored the depth of his colors. The paradox of rarity. That night he wrote in his journal, "The paradox of life is this: when you give yourself to everyone, you disappear. But when you withhold yourself, you become unforgettable." He closed the notebook and let the words sink in. They felt true, not just intellectually, but in his bones. He realized he no longer feared being misunderstood. He no longer feared losing people, because what he had gained was far greater, the ability to choose who truly deserved him. And in that choice lay freedom. A quiet triumph. He stood by the window, looking out at the city. The light shimmered, the streets pulsed with life, but for once he didn't feel lost in the noise. He felt rare, not in the sense of being better than others, but in the sense of finally being true, whole, intact. And in that rarity was a quiet triumph, the knowledge that he no longer needed to beg for value. His very unavailability had become proof of it.
The desert of solitude stretched long and dry, but every desert hides seeds, waiting for rain. For weeks, he had felt only the ache of absence, the weight of missing voices, the sting of being misunderstood, the sharp edges of loneliness. Yet something subtle was beginning to change. The silence that once pressed on him like a burden was shifting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it was transforming into space. And in that space, he began to notice life again. The first signs of growth. It started small. One morning, he brewed coffee and sat by the window as sunlight spilled across the table. The steam curled upward, golden in the light. And for the first time in months, he didn't rush to check his phone. He simply sat, breathing in the warmth, savoring the quiet. The world hadn't ended overnight. His worth hadn't disappeared. Life was still here, simple, steady, waiting for him to notice. He realized he had been so consumed with serving others that he had forgotten the taste of ordinary joy. The silence was reminding him. A different kind of presence. He began taking long walks without his phone. At first, it felt strange, as if he were missing an appendage. But soon, he found himself attuned to details he had overlooked for years. The laughter of children echoing from a playground, the rough texture of tree bark beneath his hand,
the way wind carried the smell of rain before a storm. The more he withdrew from the constant pull of others, the more he became present with the world itself. For the first time, silence didn't mean absence, it meant presence. Jung's wisdom. In his journal, he copied a line from Jung: "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." He read it over and over. All his life, he had looked outward for validation, outward for approval, outward for love. He had been dreaming other people's dreams, carrying other people's burdens, reacting to other people's needs. But now, in the stillness of withdrawal, he was awakening, not to the world's expectations, but to his own truth. A return to himself. He began writing again, something he hadn't done in years. Not for anyone else, not for recognition, but simply to hear his own voice on the page. Some nights he sketched aimlessly, filling notebooks with images that made no sense to anyone but him. Other nights he played music softly in the dark, letting notes wash over him like a tide. These weren't grand achievements, they weren't things to show or share, but they were his. And each act, no matter how small, felt like reclaiming a fragment of himself he had long abandoned. The power of selectivity. With this newfound clarity, he also became more selective. He realized not every call deserved to be answered. Not every request deserved his energy. Not every person deserved his presence. At first, this felt harsh, but slowly he understood protecting his energy wasn't cruelty, it was respect. Respect for himself. He began asking different questions. Who truly deserves my time? Who brings me peace instead of chaos? Who accepts my silence instead of resenting it? And the answers, though painful, were liberating. His circle grew smaller, but his connections grew deeper. The mask falls away. One evening, he met a friend for dinner. In the past, he would have filled the silence with nervous chatter, rushing to prove he was still likable, still agreeable. But this time, he didn't. He let the pauses breathe. He let his real thoughts surface. At first, his friend seemed unsettled. This wasn't the man they were used to. But then something remarkable happened. The conversation shifted. It became slower, more honest, less scripted. By dropping the mask, he had invited authenticity. And authenticity, he realized, was far richer than approval. The quiet joy. Weeks into this rebirth, he felt it at last. Joy. Not the frantic joy of being needed, not the temporary high of pleasing others, but a quiet, steady joy of simply existing. It came while reading by the window, sunlight warming his skin. It came while walking home at dusk, the city humming softly around him. It came while lying in bed, no phone in hand, no voices demanding his attention, only his breath, steady and calm. This was the joy of being whole within himself. A stronger self. Looking back, he saw the arc of his journey, the exhaustion, the breaking, the shadow, the desert of solitude, and now this fragile but undeniable rebirth. He realized he was no longer the man who had once been a puppet to others' needs. He was no longer the mask. He was himself, scarred, imperfect, still learning, but real. And in that reality, he felt stronger than he ever had felt while chasing approval. A whisper of what's next. One night, as he closed his journal, he smiled to himself. The silence that once terrified him now felt sacred. It wasn't something to fear or avoid. It was something to protect. Because in that silence, he had found not just relief, but rebirth. And though he knew the journey was far from over, he also knew this: he would never again trade his wholeness for the illusion of being needed.
The silence was no longer heavy. It no longer felt like punishment or exile or guilt. It had become sacred. He sat by his window one night, city lights glowing beneath him, and realized how far he had come. Months ago, he was a puppet pulled by invisible strings, drowning in availability, suffocating under the weight of everyone else's needs. Now he sat in the same chair, in the same apartment, but with a completely different presence. He was not exhausted. He was not invisible. He was not afraid. He was free. The loneliness of the strong. Freedom didn't mean the loneliness had disappeared. If anything, solitude had deepened. The circle of people in his life had shrunk. Some connections had withered, others had broken entirely. There were fewer voices around him now. But he no longer saw that as loss. He remembered Jung's words, "The loneliest walk is the walk of individuation." The path of becoming yourself is rarely crowded. It strips away illusions, projections, dependencies. It leaves you standing alone with your truth. And in that aloneness, he had discovered strength. It was not the emptiness of being abandoned, but the fullness of being whole. No more justifications. He no longer explained himself. He no longer rushed to fill silence with apologies or excuses. When he said no, it was simply no. When he withdrew, it was simply withdrawal. When he chose silence, it was simply silence. At first, people had resisted. They had accused him of arrogance, selfishness, cruelty, but with time, those voices quieted or vanished altogether. And those who remained no longer asked for explanations. They accepted his boundaries as naturally as the rising sun. For the first time in his life, he owed nothing to anyone but himself. A presence reclaimed. He noticed something new. When he entered a room now, he carried a presence he had never carried before. Not because he demanded it, but because he no longer scattered himself. His energy was whole, intact, preserved. People noticed it, even if they couldn't name it. Conversations slowed when he spoke. Arguments softened in his silence. The same man who had once blended into the background now seemed impossible to ignore. The difference wasn't louder words. The difference was a quieter soul. No longer afraid being misunderstood. The greatest freedom came from this. He no longer feared being misunderstood. Once, the thought of people thinking he was cold, selfish, or arrogant would have crushed him. Now he understood that being misunderstood was inevitable when you stopped playing the role others had written for you. And so he welcomed it. To be misunderstood meant to be real. To be misjudged meant to be free. He no longer needed everyone to like him. He no longer needed everyone to stay. He only needed to stay true to himself. The new compass. He began to live with a new compass, one built not on obligation but on alignment. He asked himself, quietly, before each decision, does this bring me peace? Does this nourish me? Does this honor who I am? If the answer was no, he stepped back, without guilt, without hesitation. It was astonishing how simple life became when filtered through this compass. No more frantic rushing to please, no more endless draining of energy, no more exhaustion masquerading as virtue, just clarity. And in living this way, he became rare. Not rare because he withdrew from everyone, but rare because he chose carefully. His time was no longer a commodity. His presence was no longer an obligation. His energy was no longer scattered. And people responded. Those who once overlooked him now sought his attention more carefully. Those who once dismissed him now respected him, and those who truly loved him cherished him more deeply. He had become unforgettable not by trying to be, but by daring not to be everywhere at once. The final realization. One evening he wrote in his journal, "Being loved means nothing if I have to abandon myself for it. True love, true respect, begins when I choose myself first." He set the pen down and smiled. The words were not angry, not desperate, not bitter. They were simply true. He realized he no longer needed to chase meaning or chase people or chase approval. He had found what he had been searching for all along, not in others, but in himself. The quiet triumph. As the night deepened, he turned off his lamp and let the city glow wash over him. He felt no urge to check his phone, no guilt pressing against his chest, no fear of being forgotten. He felt light, whole, present, and for the first time in his life, he understood what freedom really meant. It wasn't the absence of others. It wasn't the absence of responsibility. It even wasn't the absence of pain. It was the presence of himself, unaltered, unmasked, undeniable.
The silence had given him strength, but strength comes with a price. In the days after he first dared to withdraw, something strange began to happen. He wasn't just facing the anger or confusion of others, he was facing his own. At night, when the city quieted and there were no calls to answer, no messages to respond to, he felt a storm rising inside him. A storm made of old fears, whispers from the past, shadows that had followed him for years, but were always drowned out by the noise of availability. And now that he had silenced the world, those whispers had nowhere to hide. The child who learned to please. He remembered a boy, himself, sitting at a wooden table in a kitchen filled with arguments. A boy who discovered very young that keeping quiet, nodding, and saying okay was safer than resisting, that a smile could stop a fight, that agreeing, even when it hurt, could keep love from walking away. He remembered the subtle lessons, praise when he behaved, cold silence when he rebelled. He learned that his worth wasn't in who he was, but in what he could give: obedience, kindness, availability. The boy had been clever enough to build a mask that kept him safe, clever enough to believe that pleasing everyone was the price of being loved. But that boy was still alive inside him, clutching the strings, terrified of what would happen if he ever let go. Jung's shadow. Jung had written, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the conscious conscious." And now, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, he understood. The shadow wasn't some abstract idea, it was staring back at him. The shadow was his fear of being abandoned, his terror of saying no and being left alone, his rage at himself for being so available, mixed with guilt for even wanting to pull away. The shadow was ugly, contradictory, uncomfortable, and yet it was the part of himself he had spent his whole life running from. The voice of fear. That night, lying in bed, he heard it clearly for the first time. If you stop answering, they'll leave you. If you withdraw, no one will love you. You are only valuable when you are useful. The voice was sharp, cruel, familiar. It was the echo of parents, teachers, friends, every authority he had ever tried to please. But now it sounded like his own voice, lodged deep inside his skull. And as he listened, he realized this voice had been directing his life for decades. Every yes, every instant reply, every anxious smile had been a way to silence that voice. The problem wasn't just the people who pulled his strings. The problem was the shadow inside him that let them. The breaking point. One evening, the guilt came crashing down like a wave. After ignoring a call from someone who had leaned on him for years, he sat shaking on the floor, overcome with dread. His mind replayed the same thought. You're selfish. You're cruel. You'll end up alone. Tears came hot and sudden, not because of the friend he hadn't answered, but because of the little boy inside him, still desperate for approval, still terrified of being abandoned. For the first time, he allowed himself to weep for that boy, to feel the weight of decades spent serving everyone but himself, to admit how deeply afraid he was of being unloved if he dared to exist without a mask. Facing the shadow. Jung's words echoed again. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This was his fate. Until now. A life directed by the unconscious fear of rejection. A life of over-availability disguised as kindness. But now, staring into the darkness of his apartment, he whispered back to the voice inside him. Yes, I'm afraid of being abandoned. Yes, I'm terrified of being unloved. But I am more terrified of abandoning myself. The words shook as he said them, but they were real. They were the first honest words he had spoken to himself in years. The turning of the tide. Something shifted after that night. The fear didn't vanish. It was still there, lurking in the shadows. But he had named it. He had faced it. And in naming it, he had stolen some of its power. He began to see the shadow everywhere. In the panic that rose when a message went unanswered. In the guilt that twisted his stomach when he said no. In the shame he felt when someone accused him of changing. Each time, he paused, breathed, and remembered. This is not truth. This is shadow. And slowly, piece by piece, he felt the strings loosen. The silence that heals. In the days that followed, he leaned deeper into silence, not as an escape, but as medicine. He went for long walks without his phone, sat in cafes without rushing to reply to messages, spent evenings reading, writing, simply being. And in those moments of silence, he began to hear a different voice. Not the voice of fear, but the voice of himself. It was quieter, gentler, harder to hear beneath the old noise, but it was there. And every time he chose silence, it grew stronger. A new kind of courage. Facing the shadow wasn't about erasing it. It was about carrying it consciously. He understood now that his fear of abandonment would never disappear completely, but it didn't have to rule him. He could feel the difference in his body. His shoulders were lighter, his breath steadier, his nights less haunted. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't living as a puppet. He was living as a man who had looked his shadow in the eye and dared to keep walking anyway. And though he knew the road ahead would not be easy, he also knew something he hadn't known before. He was not afraid of his darkness anymore.